Hi, everyone. I thought I would do a short video on the early church view of the law given Moses, and this gives you some context in which you can make a decision. Do you think Paul has a lot of influence by the very first generation after Christ? So we're talking about from 70, so 40 years after Jesus would be about 74, 75 through that generation. That'd be a whole generation later. And so from 75, let's say, till about 105, what are we going to find in that group? Maybe a little later, 150. So we're talking one or two generations. How effective is the message of Jesus versus the message of Paul, which is, anti-law? The law is given by angels. You don't have to follow it. Why do you want to obey those who are no gods? That's Galatians 3 and 4. So just keep those dichotomies in mind. There's two choices here. You can go one way or the other way. And we'll start with Clement of Rome in his letters to the Corinthians. Says this used to be it was part of early New Testament canon, no doubt. This was what you would, if you go to church, you would hear copies of the writings of Clement being read to you, and he was treated as canon, whatever that may mean at the time. His first epistle affirms in 1 verse 5 that the Christian community initially, quote, walked according to the laws of God. That's a quote. But recently, quote, walked not according to the rule of God's commandments. That's in chapter 2, verse 4. So he's concerned very much about something that Jesus would be concerned about. But would Paul be concerned about? Absolutely not. Now, people say, oh, yeah, but no, Paul says you can't commit these sins, that sin. Excuse me. We're talking about the word commandments. And so he might think there's some sin left, but that would have to be something that's so offensive to conscience that you don't need a commandment to read about it. You would just know it. That's the only way to reconcile Paul to himself, because he basically says the law was given by angels, so all of it's gone. Now what's left? Only what your conscience tells you was wrong. Paul says that's basically what he lives by, his conscience, but no longer by the written letter of the law, which he says kills. But when Clement says commandments, he's talking about something you can read. That's not something you're gonna, your what your sensibility is about something. It's actually something that is external to you that you can read, put down on a piece of paper, and handwrite it yourself, copy it, and keep a record of it. Okay, so this is important. The same work references the sacrifices are still ongoing at Jerusalem and exhorts to continue the offerings and sacrifices required by the law. Now that's fascinating because I would have thought, well, most people say, well, Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. Why isn't that? Why are any sacrifices being done? Well, obviously that is not the early church interpretation. That's how I would read this, is they had not told people that you should not do the offerings anymore. In fact, here he's saying you should be doing the offerings and the sacrifices. And so this is something that it's some evidence on that other side of the coin, because some people say, well, the Clementine recognitions, which were edited by Rufinus to say that the Christians did not believe in any sacrifice anymore at all. And all I have to say is, for some reason, hard to understand, but Constantine, this is in the 300s, but anything that's Constantine wants, you have to keep an eye on, because it can pollute the past. What things that you think are from the past, you think these writings are not touched by people in the 300s. I have another thing coming for you. They're editing all this stuff, so you have to read through the lens. Always keep in mind, does anybody get a benefit in the 300s from what they're saying? So this doesn't benefit the people in 300s, because Constantine had a program of getting rid of pagan sacrifices. And people say, oh, that means he's a good Christian. No, because the government had to pay for all that stuff. So does the government want, and it was free. It was, people expected it to be free food. So it's a huge social welfare program that I could imagine Constantine would like to cut out, and has nothing to do with Christianity or faith or whether sacrifices are good or bad. And then rewriting that into the past would be what Rufinus would do with the Clementine homilies. It makes sense. It's a possibility. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's how you have to read stuff. Okay, but anyway, that's in First Clement, chapter 17, verses 14 to 22. I've read all these things. So I'm not getting this from third hand. I read Clement and very carefully to see what his view of the law was. This places it as written no later than 70 AD, of course, because the temple was still there until 70. There were sacrifices were continuing until that time. When the temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, see our article, Clement's letters to the Corinthians. And I'm not going to go there. We're just going to keep going here. Justin Martyr, 100. He lived from 100 to 165 AD. So he lived for about 65 years. This, I would say, is sort of like the second generation. Maybe you could even call him halfway into the third generation after Christ. But still, how influential is Paul in his life? Now, just so you know, this guy has more writings than almost anyone that survived from that age. And guess what? Guess what percentage of Paul? Before I tell you the amount. Guess what percentage of Paul? And this people have calculated the percentage to the exact number. What percentage of Justin's writings mention a quotation of Paul, or even a thought of Paul, or even a word of Paul? The answer is 0. 0, 0 with a big, fat, round 0. And so people say, well, and Justin would say things that are anti-Jewish, just so that you know. Okay, and this is how people say it's impossible to imagine that Justin, who to justify his anti-Judaizing, sometimes he doesn't. He said, and this I think is added from the future into the past. Just so you know, Justin is not more free than anyone else from that happening. So I think that's what happens. But the question's always asked, well, if has those opinions, wouldn't he have mentioned Paul? And so that's a good question. Paul had some of the most horrific statements about the Jews. They've killed the Lord. They're the enemies of mankind. Yeah, that's in First Thessalonians, I think. Yeah. So we're going to look at that one of these days. So yeah, Paul was an extreme anti-Semite, and for some reason, even though he's Semitical, he claims to be Semitical. Anyway, the point is this: Justin Martyr, hundreds and hundreds of, I think more records are survived of him, not one single quote. And people mention that many times, and they're always stunned. Like, how can anyone in that period have no mention of Paul? Because he's not important. He just doesn't factor into anything. And that's what I'm trying to make a point. And when you get to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and Arius is quoting something from Paul, he loses. Why would he lose? Because nobody cares what Paul thinks. So yeah, Jesus is the firstborn of creation, so says Paul, but nobody cares. And they're going to go with the idea that Jesus is God, which it doesn't depend on one single verse ever saying that for sure, clear cut. And then you've got Paul clear cut saying he's the firstborn of creation. You would think that when you weigh the two, there's no verse supporting Athanasius exactly, but we have this explicit statement that Jesus is the firstborn of creation. We need to affirm that. And that's all that Arius was arguing for. And he loses. So how can he lose when he's just advancing Paul's argument? So it just tells you, this should tell you. Now let's look at Justin Martyr's doctrine. Justin referenced Matthew 5, verse 20. I hope we all know where that is. Jesus is talking about the law and the prophets, and I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And anybody who teaches you to keep the law and the prophets will be great in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever teaches you not, even the least command, will be called by those in the kingdom the least. That's the passage we're talking about. So he quotes that. He references it. When Jesus says we must live a more righteous life than the Pharisees. So in 520, Jesus takes the next step. He says that after giving that speech about the law still applying, he then says, and your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. And people go, oh my gosh, Paul tells us the Pharisees were the most righteous of all. So how are we going to live more righteous than them? Well, you got to always listen to Jesus. Jesus says they were not teaching the law. In fact, he says you were teaching the lesser command of tithing, and you were neglecting teaching the more important and weightier commands of the law, which were mercy, which is Exodus 20, verse 6. What's that about? Just to make a quick lesson here. Jesus, Yahweh says that I will give you mercy if you what? Love me and obey my commandments. So when you repent, you need to tell God, I'm sorry. I love you. I'm going to renew my love commitment to you, and I'm going to obey your commands. And that's mercy. And that the Pharisees did not teach about mercy. They taught something called unconditional election of all people of Israel. You're all going to heaven. That's what they were taught by the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in eternal life, but they also believed it was unconditional election. Unconditional election. All Jews go to heaven. Paul actually quotes this in Romans 10. He says, all Jews will be saved. So don't worry about them. I'm worried about you Gentiles. All you got to have is faith. They don't have to even do anything. They're already saved. So don't worry about the Jews. So this unconditional election idea is in Paul's own words, but we know it independently. I think it's from Josephus, who explains this is the doctrine of the Pharisees. So they had no principles of right or wrong. People have them completely misunderstood because they've listened to Paul forever saying they were the most righteous, rigorous keepers of the law. False, 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 false. Jesus knows best. Josephus knows better than Paul. And Paul maybe had his own reason why he wanted to make it sound like the Pharisees were the most righteous, because he claimed to be a Pharisee. He was just put that mantle on your shoulder, call them righteous or followers of law, and then you can get away claiming that you were the most righteous person. And Paul actually says in a testimony in court, he says, I've never even committed a sin in all good conscience. And the high priest has him slapped for lying right on the spot. Not saying that's the right thing to do, but the high priest was pretty and they're from the Sadducee party, and they're looking at this Pharisee claiming he's never sinned. And, the Sadducees are thinking to themselves, you guys teach we're all unconditionally elected, so you don't even try to keep the law. That's what he's thinking, just like Jesus would have thought. But Paul's thinking, no, because we don't even study the law. We're Pharisees. We don't need to study the law because nobody has to follow it. We're unconditionally elected. So by the way, Paul did not make a dramatic change from Phariseeism to what he was believing. He was still a Pharisee because the Pharisees believe in unconditional election. No laws matter. And you go, oh, that's terrible, but just study it. That's all you need to do. Anyway, this followed Jesus' teaching. The law would not pass away until heaven and earth would pass away, and that those who teach against the law's continuity are least, but those who teach its continuity are the greatest. Matthew 5:17-19. Justin then comments what 5:20 means in that context. In the dialogue of Justin, it says this meant Jesus intended our behavior, quote, must surpass the Pharisees' way of living. And if we did not, quote, we might not be sure we could be saved. So do you think that's what Jesus meant? I do. Otherwise, why would he say you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees? So I think Justin's actually putting it a little too soft. Jesus was emphatic about it. In context, Jesus portrayed the Pharisees as lawless, teaching tithing, but nothing else from the law. Matthew 23, verse 23. So that's where that comes from. Jesus says, you taught mercy. Oh, I didn't finish my thought on that, and they also failed to teach the judgments of the law. So if you study the word judgments in the law, it's those principles that are what is right and wrong to do. And they fill up a lot of the law. A lot of the law is telling stories about, Joseph and his family and the famines and things that happen to people. But you know what? There's a lot of judgments of right and wrong, and the Pharisees weren't teaching them. They're unconditionally elected. Why would they bother? Okay, so we'll just move faster here. Hence, Justin was saying that Jesus in Matthew 5:20 said one had to live a better life than the generally lawless Pharisees. So he seems to have a completely non-Pauline view of how to live. Basically, we look at the law, we try to follow the law more zealously. That may explain why Justin never quotes Paul in hundreds of documents in hundreds of places. One of the most prolific writers and most prolific surviving writer of that era. Irenaeus, 130 to 202 AD. So now we're moving into the third to fourth generation of Lyon, France, gave the early judgment on the law's continuity among Christians at total odds with Paul. How can this be going on? He says, the decalogue, that's the Ten Commandments, however, was not canceled by Christ, but is always in force. Men were never released from its commandments against heresies. Ante-Nicene, Book 4, Chapter 16. So wait a minute. I thought Paul said the law was given by angels, and why do you want to obey those who are no gods? And if you want to observe the times and seasons, the days, meaning the Sabbath days, you're being in bondage again to those who are weak and beggarly elements. This is Galatians 3 and 4, everybody. Sorry to tell you. Or his whole analogy in Galatians between Hagar and Hagar is now the people of Israel. She's a slave woman, and she's cast out because she's subject to the law. And the free woman, Sarah, he's inverting Hagar and Sarah. So he's teaching us that the free woman is the person, Sarah, who has no law to follow. So he's in, I call it the great inversion. So Sarah's children were subject to the law of Moses, and that was kind of the whole thing. They're brought to Sinai, they sign on, they do a covenant with God, they promise to keep the 10 commandments. And Paul's just completely saying those people who made that promise are now going to be, instead of Sarah's children, I'm going to call them Hagar's children. And he says it's just an analogy. I'm just making an analogy. It's like a figure of speech. But he's telling us to take it seriously. So he's completely inverted the law as a bad and negative thing and makes it like only a slave woman has to follow these laws. Or he calls it in Galatians, it's just a tutor, it's just a temporary thing. And then we're going to outgrow it. We're going to outgrow God's commands. And it was eventual. And you know what? It's now. We now don't need it anymore. And he has no authority whatsoever. He doesn't even quote God. He doesn't even quote Jesus endorsing anything he's saying. He just makes it up. A totally made up guy. How we've ever fallen for him is just astounding to me. I can't believe I ever followed and took him seriously, and I did. But well, you know why? Because you get all the benefits. I get all of heaven, and I have nothing to do to get it. I just have to actually espouse that I believe everything he says. If I just say I believe him, I'm going to heaven. Jesus died, buried, and resurrected. I go to heaven. Paul signed me up. My name is on the dotted line. We all do it. We all did it. All of us who joined the Pauline Church. I did it. But that's not Christianity. That's a Christianity without Christ. Now, what we're reading are people who knew Christ. And this is next is Irenaeus. Let's finish up with him. In the text, Irenaeus explains, quote, preparing for this life, the Lord himself did speak in his own person to all alike the words of the decalogue, that's the 10 commandments. And therefore, in like manner, do they remain permanently with us, receiving by means of his advent in the flesh extension and increase, but not abrogation. Book 4, chapter 16.4. The fact that he says there's not an abrogation means that, in my mind, he's implying he knows that there is somebody who claims it's abrogated. He knows of the message of Paul that it's abrogated. He doesn't even give Paul time of day to say his name. He just says it's not abrogated. Boom. I don't have to talk to you. I don't have to even mention the guy's name who teaches the opposite of me. Let's tell the truth of what Jesus taught. Boy, this is how refreshing, how wonderful it would be to live in the world these people lived in. Roman Catholicism hasn't come yet. Constantine hasn't corrupted our church yet. This seems to be the church that is taking the best fruit and not getting involved in disputes. Paul is a nobody. He's been rejected by the church. Nobody's following Paul in this group. The Marcionites have made Paul their only apostle, just so you know, at the same time. 140, this is when it's just going to begin. So right around this time, there's this huge, I don't want to say huge movement, but a very strong movement to create a church solely around Paul. But it's not a Christian church. They don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. That's a fundamental precept of Marcion. He does not believe Jesus is the Messiah. He believes he's God, though. And that conflicts with Paul, too, because Paul doesn't think he's God. He's very clear on that when Jesus is given the kingdom, he's going to hand over everything to God, which means somebody other than himself. That's how Paul talks. So Paul doesn't think Jesus is God, but that's not the point. Anyway, let's keep going here. Irenaeus similarly said in the same context, quote, the commands of the Old Covenant as epitomized in the Decalogue, that's the 10 commandments, since they were functional before Moses, and this is still part of a quote, just so you know, they remain authoritative in the New Covenant. Christ does not contradict the 10 words. He fulfills and expands them. That's still part of a quote. And the citation, but I was extracting it from different parts. Against Heresies 4.15.1, 4.16.3, 4.16.1, 4.13.1. In Irenaeus' attack on the heretic Marcion, who I just mentioned, that Paul only is ism, he cited Matthew 5, verse 20, to prove Jesus had every intention the law must continue. Okay, so Irenaeus, so I said to you, he said the law is not abrogated, and I said he must have had in mind Paul. Well, he definitely does, because Marcion is bringing up Paul's doctrines and trying to make it the exclusive doctrine of the church. And so by saying that, he was rebuffing Paul. So rebuffing Marcion is the same as rebuffing Paul, because Marcion is all about Paul. So he's saying in response to Marcion that Matthew 5:20 meant that Jesus had every intention the law must continue. This passage proved that Marcion committed a heresy by teaching that the gospel was, quote, in opposition to and overturning of the law of the past. Irenaeus Against Heresies, Book 4. In other words, we must exceed the obedience to the law which the Pharisees failed to follow, as Jesus depicted them as largely lawless except for tithing. See the e-catena for Matthew 5:20 at www.earlychristianwritings.com. And I've showed this in prior episodes as a way of learning about what did people think about certain passages. You go to www.earlychristianwritings.com and they will find all the remarks about a certain passage, or at least they try to, that cite that passage. And so you can look up what the, quote, church fathers, I wish they'd picked a different word for it because we're not supposed to call anyone fathers, but that's the only way people refer to them, unfortunately. That's a sin that our fathers, the church fathers made, and now they make us use these words to talk about it. I'll find another new word one of these days. Okay, Didascalia Apostolorum. We don't hear about this very often. This is a Syrian book, meaning the Syrian church. It was from the early 200s. This work that reflected orthodoxy of that period says one of the 4 identifying marks of heretics is they taught against employing Torah and prophets. One scholar, Oscar Scarson, in Heresy and the Pastoral Epistles, in a journal called Themelios 20.1 in October 1994, his article begins at page 9. At page 10, if you click the link, you'll see the article, notes that, quote, a passage in the Syrian Didascalia Apostolorum from the 200s defining heresy states, quote, the heretics all had one law, that they should not employ the Torah and the prophets. Who does that sound like? And that they should blaspheme God Almighty. Well, I think it's their interpretation of what they're doing. And 3, and should not believe in the resurrection. Okay, so there were people saying there is no such a thing as a resurrection. In fact, Paul was dealing with that. People were told there is no resurrection. So, and that may be, just so you understand, is your body won't be resurrected. It doesn't mean you won't have eternal life, but that your body will never come back. And maybe some people didn't want their body to come back, and so they're hoping, can I get a new body? So that had to be fleshed out. So I put more, the quote is more important than the issue of the Torah. So the Torah and the prophets and would not be employed by the heretics. And you can't use that to correct them. They're incorrigible, so to speak. And this is in a book called by R.U. Connolly, Didascalia Apostolorum, Oxford, 1929. It was republished in 1969, and it's a quote you'll find at page 202. Next is Clement of Alexandria. He's writing around the 200s. In his work, Exhortation to the Heathen, taught as a principle they should listen to the Hebrew prophets, of which he cited Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and Moses, as a means to know the road to salvation, echoing Christ's words to the rich young ruler. That's Matthew 19 and Luke 16. And here's what he says. It is now time, as we have dispatched in order the other points, to go to the prophetic scriptures. For the oracles present us with the appliances necessary for the attainment of piety, and so establish the truth. The divine scriptures and institutions of wisdom form the short road to salvation. Devoid of embellishment, of outward beauty, of diction, of wordiness and seductiveness, they raise up humanity strangled by wickedness, teaching men to despise the casualties of life, and with one and the same voice remedying many evils, they at once dissuade us from the pernicious deceit and clearly exhort us to the attainment of the salvation set before us. Clement of Alexandria is not the same as the Clement of Rome. And this is in a work called The True Doctrine is to be Sought in the Prophets, chapter 8, at this link. So that's chapter 8 of his work entitled Exhortation to the Heathen. Clement then goes into an extensive series of quotes from the prophets, which include Moses, and cites Paul as in support, as if Paul never said anything about the law's abrogation. So this is an old game, which I think people are going to have to learn not to do anymore. Is Paul speaks out of both sides of his mouth, and he can say in one breath, you're eternally secure, and in the next breath, he'll actually say about himself, he says, I cannot say that I'm before the time that I'm justified, because I can't make that assessment whether I'm going to be saved or not. He says this in 1 Corinthians 4 or 14, I can't remember now. And it just always stunned me. It's like, here you're telling us we're all eternally secure, but you personally are not sure. So, yeah, you can always Paul, it can talk out of both sides of his mouth. So it's like if James calls somebody, obviously Paul, is a double-minded man, which means you can never pin him down. And I call him the unfalsifiable Paul. You'll always find something he says that's correct, but you will have tons of wrong stuff. So we've come to this view, and I hate to say it, but the Pauline paradox, the word paradox tells us, they're contradictory thoughts. And what we're trying to do is fit a round peg into a square hole. And there's a problem with that because you're now trying to force things to keep somebody so that you don't look bad saying, hey, this guy's voice is not harmonious with himself, that he is discrediting himself when you can provably show he contradicts himself. So the paradox is solved by removing him, which is the decision, the apostolic decision of the 12. But I digress. Let's keep going. I'm not going to go through this lengthy section, but I got this out of the, you can read it in full at this webpage article. Tertullian in 207 AD was the voice of orthodoxy when he wrote against Marcion. Marcion advocated in 144 AD a Paulinist movement, claiming Paul alone was the apostle to the Gentiles, and that the Jesus portrayed by the 12, including Matthew and John, was for a different dispensation. So that's how he viewed Jesus. And there's actually, after Jesus' death and resurrection, he is a new Jesus, basically somebody who is talking to Paul only. And that's why Paul becomes the only apostle and the other 12 fall away. And that Jesus they spoke to is basically dead and gone, as a lot of dispensationalists have said in the past. And even Luther said the law and all of that is all dead and gone. So I'm just going to say that's the way they view the Jesus of the Gospels. He's no longer relevant to us, except to the extent that he died. I guess they take his death and burial and resurrection. I guess they take his death and burial and atonement for their benefit, but they don't take any of his words or commands. That they leave in the grave. But everything else, they take all the benefits and they take none of the burdens, and that's just predictable Pauline thinking. Tertullian blasted Marcion's claim the law was abrogated in Tertullian's 207 AD classic entitled Against Marcion. Here are references to this discussion from Tertullian in the 5 books of Quintus Septimus, I guess it was, Florentius, I think it is, Tertullianus Against Marcion, translated by Peter Holmes, Edinburgh, Clark, 1868. First, Tertullian rebuts Marcion's claim that Christ did away with the law by discussing Jesus' instruction to the leper to follow the law's requirements for giving thanks for a healing. So this is interesting. Tertullian is trying to rebut Marcion's claim that the law was abrogated by citing Jesus as telling somebody after you get a healing, he should make an offering that's required by the law when you have a healing. Interesting. The law about lepers had a profound meaning as respects the forms of the disease itself, Tertullian writes, and of the inspection by the high priest. The interpretation of this sense it will be our task to ascertain. Marcion's labor, however, is to object to us the strictness of the law, with the view of maintaining that here also Christ is its enemy, forestalling its enactments even in his cure of the 10 lepers. So Marcion twists everything around. So if Jesus is doing something and doing a healing, and even tells the person to go do something in compliance with the law, it's somehow really, Christ is really meaning to display the opposite, that it's no longer applicable somehow. And here's how Tertullian explains that. For as much then as he was himself the veritable high priest of God the Father, he inspected them according to the hidden purport of the law, which signified that Christ was the true distinguisher and extinguisher of the defilement of mankind. However, what was obviously required by the law he commanded should be done. Go, said he, show yourself to the priest. Yet why this, if he meant to cleanse them first? Was it as a despiser of the law, in order to prove them that, having been cured already on the road, the law was now nothing to them, nor even the priests? I think what Tertullian is saying is trying to paraphrase Marcion. So Marcion is saying, since he cured him without having to do any rituals first, and then told him give thanks, that somehow Jesus was proving that you don't need the rituals of the law because the guy got healed without doing any rituals of the law first. But the point is, you'd have to prove that the rituals of the law are required to even have a healing in the first place. So we're missing a step there, Mr. Marcion. Anyway, we'll continue. Well, the matter must, of course, pass as it best may, if anybody supposes that Christ had such views as these. So Tertullian is saying, where are you getting this from? Basically, you're just making this stuff up. That's how I'd put it. But there are certainly better interpretations to be found of the passage and more deserving of belief. How that they were cleansed on this account because they were obedient. Okay, so now he's saying he's reading into it. It's like, why are you saying that they had been lawless to this point? Why can't you say that they had been obedient to this point? And Jesus is blessing them by giving them a healing. So that, put it this way. The other side is making up the argument that Jesus is doing this to prove lawlessness is the better way of going. They didn't have to do anything to comply with the law to get a healing. And that's a guess. And Tertullian is saying, well, it's equally plausible that they were living lawful, obedient lives, and Jesus was blessing them for that. I mean, it's really an unanswered question. But to say that you can know for a fact that Jesus is showing the law has been abrogated by actually healing someone and giving them a command to do something compliant with the law is really absurd. If I were Tertullian, I would have just said that and just leave it there. You don't have to go this deep into the weeds. And went as the law required, and when they were commanded to go to the priests, and it is not to be believed that persons who observed the law could have found a cure from a God that was destroying the law. So he's saying, let's assume they were observing the law. Then why would Jesus have cured them from their disease if he was intending to destroy the law? And so that's predicated on his own assumption that they were obedient to the law, and then saying, so you might as well say they're obedient to the law and they're getting a blessing. Then why would they be given that blessing when Jesus is really standing for the proposition that the law is abrogated? So Tertullian is trying to make a point that Marcion's idea that Jesus would heal these people, and for a variety of reasons, a myriad of reasons, that it implied anything about the abrogation of the law is unfounded. And I think that's all he needed to say. He's actually given too much credence to the argument. Is just preposterous on its face. Anyway, but this is important. So this is how the church is, how close Tertullian is reading Jesus to affirm Marcion, a Paulinist through and through, diehard Paulinist, is wrong. Now, every time he's criticizing Marcion, you think of it, he's criticizing Paul, because you and I don't think about it, but the healing of those lepers and then Jesus giving them a command from the law means what? That law, Jesus would say, if this happened to you, he's died, been resurrected, and he's ascended into heaven. What do you think Jesus would expect if you got a healing? A miraculous healing. And that you should comply with the law, and you go give an offering of thanks, whatever that may be. It's proportionate to whatever. I don't know. I don't even know what that law is, because I've never had a miraculous healing. But I'm going to tell you what, if I have a miraculous healing, I'm going to look up the law and make that offering to God. So I'm going to pray for healing. I've got a few pains. I would love them to miraculously go away. All right. Anyway, so let's read a little further here. I'm going to stop it so we don't. All right, I'm going to try to move a little quicker here. Tertullian proves Jesus did not do away with the law because he told the rich man that obeying the law's precepts was the key to eternal life. Remember here, if Paul were a true authority in the church, Tertullian would have had to address Paul's opposing thesis upon which Marcion explicitly relied. But Tertullian ignores Paul and simply cites Jesus' words in rebuttal that the law remains, and Jesus simply supplemented but did not supplant them. And this is what Tertullian says. Again, this is 205 AD. This is before the Constantinian purge, Constantinian, implementation of a complete apostasy from God's law, saying you don't have to obey Sabbath anymore. That's a key part of Constantine's position, by the way. And that's what makes that church, the Roman Catholic Church, became apostate the minute they went to Nicaea, and he insisted that you can no longer have anything in common with the Jews, which he meant Passover, and evidently, obviously, the Sabbath. No more Sabbath rest. You have to do your Sabbath rest on Sunday. You have to go to church on Sunday. That became the new norm, and that made that church an apostate church. It's just, apostasy is anybody who teaches and follows an apostate view of life, where you're not going to obey the Ten Commandments, and I refuse to obey it. It's not like you're having difficulty obeying the Sabbath command. You refuse to obey it. You are an apostate under the law. You're worthy of death. That's what the law says. Being killed right now, so you don't contaminate the public. Okay, so this is serious stuff at the time. So Jesus is being very serious, and so is Tertullian. So let's read this. When afterwards a certain man asked him, "Good master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus inquired whether he knew that is, in other words, whether he kept the commandments of the Creator, in order to testify that it was by the Creator's precepts that eternal life is acquired. Then, when he affirmed that from his youth up he had kept all the principal commandments, Jesus said to him, "One thing you yet lack: sell all that you have and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. Come, follow me." Well, now, Marcion, and all you companions in misery and associates in hatred with that heretic, what will you dare say to this? Did Christ rescind the aforementioned commandments? Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor thy father and mother. Or did he both keep them and then add what was wanting to them? This very precept, however, about giving to the poor was very largely diffused through the pages of the law and the prophets. This vainglorious observer of the commandments was therefore convicted of holding money in much higher estimation than charity. This verity of the gospel then stands unimpaired. And I just want to point out something. A verse got dropped out that follows this in that passage that makes it clear that it's about charity and not simply you have to live an impoverished life. Is Peter says, well, nobody can be saved, and Jesus says, well, this man. I'll put this up somewhere in a video soon. I think I've already done it once or twice. But basically, Jesus says to Peter, this man, his sons and brothers, basically fellow Israelites, go out begging and hungry, and yet nothing goes out of his house to help them. So we understand that this man is being given an order to make up for all of his uncharity for a long period of time. So that makes more sense. It's not about the duty to become impoverished and live as a beggar. It's about yourself helping those who have to beg for a living. When you are living rich and high on the hog, you have to now basically, Jesus is commanding him to invert positions, give it all away, because you haven't done any of this for all this time. So that's a lesson to be learned. All right, now we go back over here. This verity of the gospel then stands unimpaired. I am not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them. He also dissipated other doubts when he declared that the name of God and the good belong to one and the same being, at whose disposal were also everlasting life and the treasure in heaven, and himself too, whose commandments he both maintained and augmented with his own supplementary precepts. And that's an important thing. Jesus was the prophet, and we were told in Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 to 18 that a special prophet like Moses would come, whose every word would be from Yahweh. And then Yahweh speaks over Jesus and quotes from Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 to 18 when he says to Peter and John, Peter and John are the apostles present, and he says, listen to him, quoting that passage. Let's continue. So Jesus can supplement with precepts. He may likewise be discovered on the following passages of Micah, saying, he has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly and to love mercy and to be ready to follow the Lord your God. Now Christ is the man who tells us what is good, even the knowledge of the law. Thou knowest, says he, the commandments, to do justly, sell all that you have, to love mercy, to give to the poor, and to be ready to walk with God. And come, says he, follow me. So a very beautiful homily, but also a complete defense of something that's at odds with Paul. So you can just see this church three to four generations away from Jesus and Paul. They are totally a non-Pauline church. Okay, and let's just see, pre-205 followed. Okay, so there are historians will point this out, that the early church was a Jewish Christian church. And the Gentiles who followed it were in the same lineage of these are all Gentiles. Tertullian is Gentile, he's not Jewish. Same thing with Irenaeus. Clement is a Gentile. Irenaeus is a Gentile. Justin Martin is a Gentile. Clement of Rome is a Gentile. So these Gentiles are not getting the message from Paul that you don't have to worry about all this stuff. Why are you worried about all that? That's what Paul would have said. And they were fully aware of Paul because they're fighting him in the Marcionite movement. And they're going along with Jesus. Okay, so I will leave it there. And if you want to read more, there's a little bit more on Oregon. And he also believed the law continued, but he was also a very, he says this, let us have Moses large and strong. So he's in the same camp, but he's also he likes allegories, and he's just always big on the big hidden picture and everything. So he's a little bit of a different kind of read. You have to read him with it, like almost reading a story, a play, and he's making it more dramatic and makes it more exciting. He's a very good writer, and he's trying to use his skills that he learned. Okay, everybody, I hope that helps us understand that there's a big gap where Paul has no influence in the mainstream church, and that's because he was killed. His epistles were destroyed as readable material by the early order of the church, and nothing better proves what I'm saying than the fact that he is absent from these early Gentile leaders. And you can't find for me a Gentile leader of that time that is spouting Paul's writings. The only one you can find who does that is a guy named Marcion, who actually says Jesus isn't even the Christ. Okay, so just so you know. All right. Okay. God bless.